Hello everybody, I'm Stefan. I'm supposed to be actually around, but unfortunately we're in worldwide madness right now, and this is the fallback or the recorded version of my talk, Did Web Development Lose the Right Direction? And hopefully I will be around next time, but let's just kick it off with an online version right now, shall we? Alright, did web development lose the right direction? And before I want to start, what I want to tell you about is where I'm actually coming from. So I'm coming from this tech stack. This is when I did my first web development job, which was more or less 10 years ago. And I did an internship, and the e-commerce shop that I was working on was built with MySQL, Apache, and PHP. And I have to say that when I started already, I was a little bit overwhelmed by this. Because when you have very little programming experience, even this stack that now might not be the most attractive stack to some people was very intimidating for me. And then I had a look into the front end. What I found was that, first of all, there was prototype and jQuery. Right, more is always better. It was basically built using Magento, and then JavaScript frameworks started to rise. So Backbone.js was just coming up, so we sprinkled this one in. And what basically happened was that we added complexity over complexity over complexity, just step by step. It just happened slowly. But then at the same time, then projects or best practices like why-slow.org appeared. So the front end or the web community kind of figured that web performance is a thing, and that a lot of things that slow down web pages actually happen in the browser. So there were new custom best practices coming up. So I moved on, I tried to be a good web developer. Then I kicked off my first blog, which was fwdays.de. I and 3 colleagues wanted to start blogging, so we did. And this was basically Jekyll site. Jekyll is based on Ruby. Ruby is great. Unfortunately, I don't know Ruby enough to feel very comfortable with running the Jekyll site, but it did the job. And then 5 years in or something, these two appeared, which was Gulp and Grunt. These kind of gave front-end engineers the way to build kind of sophisticated build pipelines that are a little bit more complex than just minifying and concatenating things. Then I started working on my first real single-page applications built with AngularJS. And on the side, I started playing around with React and Vue. And honestly, I can really say that I love technology and I love writing JavaScript. And what else do I love? I love writing about JavaScript. So what you see there is, for example, my private blog. I publish a few posts every month. I'm fairly happy with it. You see that the navigation is snappy. It's using a cutting-edge JavaScript framework. It looks good, feels good. Overall, I'm pretty happy. When I run this through Lighthouse, which is kind of the auditing or measurement tool that is included in Google Chrome, you see there that I have a 92 performance score, 1% accessibility, 93 best practices, because there is a console warning about some deprecated stuff, which I will hopefully remove soon, 1.0 points. So overall, this is a pretty decent green rating for my blog. When I go to Web Page Test, which is the service that gives you a tool to monitor and actually measure websites, you see that the speed index is around 1000, which basically means that the majority of the page is on first view on a fast cable connection available after a second. I think this is pretty good. On a repeat view, it's then 0.7 seconds, which is also a pretty good thing. When you move on and you go with a 3G connection, the speed index is roughly 4.3 seconds and 3 on a repeated view, which is still fairly good for a not that great connection. The overall rule of thumb here is that if you have a score that is above 90% or 90 in Lighthouse, usually you're in the top 5% of performant websites. And I think that's a good thing to be in. And my site is also using all these new cool best practices, right? So all the assets, all the text assets are compressed and minified. I'm using differential loading for browsers that support ECMAScript modules and browsers that don't, using no module, using a custom font which uses a Unicode range and font display swap. Then I'm doing a lot of preloading, and of course everything is code splitted to have very tiny chunks and not kind of overwhelm the browser. And this is kind of the state that we're in. This is a lot of good best practices, and I do really care about these. And then just a few weeks ago, this website was trending on Hacker News. So what you see there is a site that is 15 or 20 years old. And I have to say, this is not very pretty, but it is snappy and is extremely fast. And when you have a look there, it is still updated. And when you look under the hood of this site, you will find basically this markup. It's a lot of tables, a lot of attributes that are deprecated these days, a lot of GIFs, but it still works. And when you go then in Google Chrome or in an auditing tool, you will find that this site doesn't have great ratings overall, but it has a performance score of 100. And even my old blog from 6-7 years ago has a better performance score than my cutting edge site that I really spent time working on every now and then up to this day. So I went over to web page test. So what you can do in web page test 2 is you can go to /video and you can pump or enter 3 sites and you can get a video like this. And here you see that really my cutting edge 2020 website is the slowest performing site. And I'm not sure how I feel about this. So you could now say, yeah, Stefan, maybe you just implemented your site very, very poorly. And even though you pretend to do good or to use best practices, maybe you just messed it up. And honestly, I think that could be. But let's just have a look on why these ratings are so differently. So when we look at the 3 sites, you see that the overall page rate of my site is the highest one, with 340K. The index file that I'm shipping is also way, way bigger than the others. CSS resources more or less the same. Then we have JavaScript resources. For my little site, I ship 22 JavaScript resources that are also preloaded, but it's still 22 resources. I don't have images on my site. There are some inlined SVGs that are not there, and I'm ignoring tracking pixel here. So I have the slowest speed index on an LTE connection, and I have the lowest Lighthouse performance score. So how could this be? So when we look at my Lighthouse performance score, you see there that I'm fairly good on the first contentful paint and the speed index, first meaningful paint. But the 3 things that matter a lot, or 3 things that are actually mattering too, is the first CPU idle time, time to interactive, and estimated input latency. And what you see there is kind of the measures that a Lighthouse uses to give you a performance score. And you see there that the time to interactive counts 5 times. And why is that? Because this gives us an idea on how busy the main thread is. And JavaScript, when you ship a lot of JavaScript, basically what you do, you're blocking the main thread. The browser tab is single threaded, and JavaScript has a direct impact on user experience. And when you have a look, for example, at these kind of things, even if you ship a lot of HTML initially, when you ship a lot of JavaScript and you're on a low running device, you can tap things and you won't see anything because the browser is just busy parsing and executing the JavaScript that you ship around and that you send down to the browser. And this is not a good experience. And frameworks play a big, big role in this. So for example, Netflix, outside of their logged in area, found out that they shipped server-side React and they also shipped client-side React. And they had a look on why things are taking so long. The reason was that they shipped the framework, they shipped Lodash, and they shipped a lot of JavaScript components that could have been built with a little bit of vanilla JavaScript instead of shipping a whole framework. So what happened is that they cut out the client-side React and Lodash. They went with a little bit of vanilla JavaScript, which could be toggling some display none and display blocks, or maybe adding some things to the DOM. And they found that they could cut the time to interactive by 50%. And this kind of raises the question if they used the right tool in the first place, right? And when you think of these kind of things, you always have to remember that 150 kilobyte, for example, of an image are not comparable to 150 kilobyte of gzip JavaScript. JavaScript has to be downloaded, parsed, and executed in a single threaded environment. Page weight is not equal page weight. You always have to kind of think of what you're shipping down. So, and if you remember, I was shipping a 340 kilobyte index file for roughly 400 words on my site. So what is in there? And I now ask myself the question, but also people on Twitter asked me that question. So basically what my response was that I was arguing myself out of this problem of so much HTML or such a heavy index HTML file, but I'm playing buzzword bingo with best practices. And basically what I told was that it's great because it's fast and it's still lighter than the rest of the internet, right? It had a green lighter score. It's still in the top 5%. But does that actually mean that it's good? I'm not sure about this anymore. And basically what I did, or what I believed in this argument is that, well, actually all this doesn't matter that much because I'm really digging the tech stack. So when I now have a look at what is actually to this day inside of my website, you will find out this big block here. So it's a typical inline data block that returns all the data that was used to render the HTML. This is used for hydration of a JavaScript framework because the JavaScript framework has to know what data was used to render the HTML. And it turned out that past me decided to inline and preload 22 articles that are listed on the index blog page. And thinking about this, I have an average session length of 1.17 pages. Why does a person need to load 22 articles, like complete articles on index, for better performance? I don't think that was the best approach. But you could now say that making a very fast website is extremely hard. But I want to question that a little bit. And my friend Phil from Netlify, he does basically this. He deploys a lot of, he's kind of the vanilla kind of guy. He deploys and develops a lot of HTML pure websites. And then a lot of people show up and it's like, hey Phil, how do you make them fast? And his response usually is that, well, I'm just not adding anything that makes it slow. And this is mainly referring to JavaScript. And then a few months ago, I was building this side project. So what you see there is tinyhelpers.dev. It is basically a resource collection. It's basically a resource collection of little web development online tools. And it has a full score on performance, accessibility, and best practices. It has time to interactive on a 3G connection of 1.4 seconds. This site is fast. And it really ships HTML only. Which is not completely true. It ships a little bit of inline JavaScript. So 2 years ago, I was giving a talk about the front-end development stack in 2018, and I said that every website is a web app and every web app is a website. And today, I couldn't disagree more with past me. Because where's the user's overhead, benefit of such overhead? And kind of shipping universal JavaScript apps is a kind of common best practice these days. So where we're coming from was static HTML with a little bit of third-party and main JavaScript, and we exchanged that with loading several bundles and inlining the data that is needed to then be used in the JavaScript scope. This is the same code that runs on the server and on the client. Which is cool by itself, right? You can reuse code. But this also means that your content is in HTML and the same content will then be in JavaScript. This is doubling down on the data that you ship. And I really want to question all of you if this is really the best way for the user. This architecture though does one thing. It offers doors and open doors to progressive enhancement, right? So in case you don't know the term progressive enhancement, the idea is that you have a base functionality when you think of some stairs. These just work and that you then can enrich them with a better experience with some additional technology. So basically this usually refers to shipping some HTML and then enriching it with some JavaScript. This is the big advantage that if the enhancement fails for some reason, it still works. And the stairs and escalator example is a quite common one. And I want to ask you one question though. How often do you see this? And I see it more often than I want to. So does progressive enhancement in this context maybe doesn't work that well? So a few years ago, I was building this site here. What you see there, Perf Tooling Today, it's another list of resources. And what you see there is basically, it's a JavaScript and search that is reflected in the URL. And when you refresh it, basically, server renders the same result. So you have a snappy experience right in the client when you interact with the search box. You get a URL that you can share. And then you have a submittable form. So even when the JavaScript is failing or is not there yet, this form still works by pressing enter and submitting it. And I hear you. Nobody really has JavaScript disabled. Which is not really true. So when you are shipping a big website on scale, you will find out that a lot of JavaScript will just time out for reasons. So for example, when you're BuzzFeed, they found out that 13 million requests for JavaScript will just time out. Because there's the unknown of the network in between. And the sentence that we don't have non-JavaScript users is purely false. Because every user is a non-JavaScript user while the JavaScript is downloading. And what I would love to see is more experiences like this. So when you go, for example, to github.com and you want to post a comment, this is basically super cool. They have one endpoint that is test issue comments, and you can do an old school form submit with a post to it, or you can do an AJAX submit to it. Whatever happens, this just works. And even the navigation in the issue or in the project settings, these are not some fancy single page application links. These are 5 old school HTML links that do a page refresh when you click on them. And I have to say that I'm very happy with GitHub's experience. This is a good site that just works. So they decided to not go with this JavaScript-driven architecture. But when we look around and see what it could open up in terms of progressive enhancement, what will we find outside in the wild that people actually do with this JavaScript and enrich the sites that are built with JavaScript? So I had a look at reactjs.org. I think React is a very nice software. So this is just an example that I found. So when you go to reactjs.org and visit the site with a fast 3G connection, you will see that it loads fairly fast. And when you navigate, it is fairly snappy. I have to say that. So when you now go to reactjs.org and you disable JavaScript, the experience initially is maybe a little bit faster. And when you click the links, I would say that the experience is also still pretty decent. So when we compare these two on initial wait, reactjs.org with JavaScript loads 527K of stuff, whereas the without JavaScript version loads 40K. And after 4 navigations, there's not much stuff happening on the JavaScript version because most of the stuff is already loaded. But still, after 4 navigations, the version without JavaScript is only at 200K in total. And it felt the same. So what was the enrichment here? What a kind of gives it the right here, or is the reason to ship that much more for the same experience? And I don't want to pick on React or any developer that does that right now, because I'm guilty of that too. I don't have much interactivity in my site. I'm shipping a bunch of JavaScript though to have a little bit of page transitions going from one route to the other. So does this architecture actually improve user experiences? And are developers using it to improve anything for their visitors? I'm not sure about this. What I am sure about though is, for example, that is harming user experience. If I would have gone to Kiev right now, this would have been the SMS that I would have received from my mobile provider. And basically what's telling me is that I get 6 megabytes for €2, but I have to use them in 24 hours. If I now have to load 1.5 meg of resources to load a single website, I do care about this. If the taxi site that I want to open to get a phone number is heavy and I'm running against my budget, I do care about this. So this is definitely harming user experience in certain scenarios for me. And the web is getting heavier and heavier and more bloated and more bloated. And I would be cool with this if this would mean that we ship a better user experience. But I don't think we do. We're just making everything more complicated and we're making everything heavier. Maybe we have to ask ourselves the question that if app frameworks are for apps after all, right? I mean, Facebook is working on React, and Facebook has this massively complex web app, which they have to maintain. There are hundreds of developers working on this. For them, it probably makes sense to have a full-fledged app framework in usage. Or when you, for example, look at Gmail. This is an app that I use every day, and it is heavy, and it's completely JavaScript driven. And I'm okay with this, because this offers a lot of great experience for me. What is cool about the Gmail, though, is that they still have this low resources version available, which only fits 25K, and it just works. It works on a spotty connection, it's fast, it is not as fancy, but it's very, very nice. So when you look around what actually the internet is using, you still find out that 85% of the internet are still running on jQuery. And even all in the JavaScript ecosystem, everybody's very vocal about React, Vue, and Angular, and all, whatever framework is coming next. It turns out that only 5% are actually using React. The web is not as cutting edge as it seems. And boring is beautiful, as we've seen in the old school websites from Italy. And boring is fast. So what benefits does client-side routing actually brings? So first of all, you are now allowed to re-implement an accessible navigation, because the browser is actually pretty good at making an accessible navigation. It shows a spinner, people know where to look at for a spinner. If there's assistive technology in place, it knows what's happening when you're visiting a new route. If you're re-implementing this with client-side navigation, first of all, you have to figure out where to place spinners. And more spinners are always better, right? And for assistive technology, then it's actually even harder, because you now have to take care of proper announcements, and that the user knows where he or she is actually where he or she is navigated to after clicking a link. And the folks from Gatsby basically did some excellent research, and the best practice there, what they found out with a lot of manual user testing, is that you should provide a skip link, which you should provide anyways. You should focus this one, and then you should include an area live region, just because you use some client-side navigation. This seems like a lot of work for me to do. And then there's the question if this really offers the benefit of using it at all. When you think of client-side navigations, what a lot of people actually had in mind with JavaScript navigations are beautiful transitions from A to B. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing them or these very often. They are possible though. So what you see there, for example, is a prototype from built by Sarah Dresner. This is built in Vue, and I think that's nice. I think that's very beautiful. I would love to see more things like this. But unfortunately, this is not what we're using client-side navigation for in the first place. And then there's, for example, Ryan Florence, who said that there is a chance that he believes client-side routing on the web is usually not preferred. And he is the co-author of React Router, which is very, very interesting to see. So when we think about JavaScript applications, we always kind of pretend, or we love to think, that we ship tailored experiences. But I want to question that too. Do we really ship tailored experiences to our users? So for me, the test here is then, could your parents deal with this? Because if my parents could enable or disable something, then it is for sure a tailored experience. So right now there's a trend of kind of using a lot of custom media queries like preferred reduced motion. So for me on macOS, how hard is it to enable the accessibility setting of reduced motion? I have to go into system preferences, I have to go into the accessibility settings, and I have to go into the display properties. There I have to set a checkbox. I'm not sure about your parents, but my parents won't find that. This is a very useful setting for people with vestibular disorder though. These are people that get really sick and dizzy when there are movements that they don't expect. This is not only for accessibility needs though. People on low battery probably don't need this JavaScript animation that soaks their battery. And it's also for people with limited time. If I'm on a rush and I know what to do, I don't care about 200 milliseconds of some transition from A to B. I just want to get the job done. And then we have dark interfaces. I still believe that the only people seeing dark interfaces these days are developers, because nobody else knows how to enable this. So on macOS, and I'm going only on macOS here because I'm using macOS, you have to go into general settings and then into the general, so system preferences and then general. I'm not changing that on my computer when I'm going to bed and sit in a dark environment with my MacBook. I'm not going there. On my phone it's a little bit better, so on the recent Android version you have at least a top level setting that you have to move there first, at least for me that was the case, to switch that quickly, so that is a little bit better. But I would still say that it is too hard for users to enable and disable it quickly. This is a very useful setting for people that are sensible to bright screens, for people that are sitting in the dark, or for people with a headache. I think it's still way too hard to enable and disable it for all the operating system browsers or whatever we have in front of us. And then we, for example, have saved data, which is a media query, or you can access it via a header, or you can set it via a header, or you can access it via navigator connection saved data. So on Google Chrome Google Chrome Mobile, you can enable light mode, which is also paired with some additional functionality. You can also enable it in the system preferences. But for example, there's no way to enable light mode on computers, which is surprising, I think. And then when you look what web developers are building there, so you see here twitter.com, and they have a save data mode. But this is not considering the save data header, or is not using users' preferences in the first place. And when you then go on, for example, and you have a look at Shopify, they implemented the usage of saved data, and they ship 13% less page weight when they found the saved data header. And they found out that 20% of Indian and Brazilian requests actually contain this header. This is not the most straightforward setting to enable for maybe a lot of devices, for a lot of devices. So what does that actually mean? That these people really want to have a different experience. Maybe these are people that are on Wi-Fi. These are Wi-Fi connections that pretend to be a good Wi-Fi, but actually are not. Maybe it's people that are tethering with their phone, or people that are unable to afford much data. And then, for example, what is fairly new is that you can actually access how fast your interconnection is using Navigator Connection Effective Type. But what does that actually tell you? So when you're on your mobile phone, this tells you how good the connection is, or how fast the Wi-Fi is. But for example, what if I'm on a fast mobile connection and I'm tethering Wi-Fi for my computer with my phone? Does that mean I want to get the premium experience with all the data that is available? Probably not. The thing is that you cannot know the user's context. Never ever. And it should be very easy for people to adjust. And when I think of my parents can, for example, deal with Firefox Reader mode. This is very straightforward. It is a set of easy controls, and I would love to see this for more things, or making things more available. And when I browse the web, I would like to have more than just the URL bar. I would like to have a lot of toggles everywhere. This could be in the browser world or in the operating system. Right now, I feel a little bit like we're missing the point on a lot of things. If you want to get more of ideas on actually what a tailored web for users means, Kyle Simpson, he is a Getify and is known for the You Don't Know JavaScript series. He gives this excellent talk, which I highly can recommend. So, are we failing to ship a tailored user experience after all? And I'm talking about developers, browser makers, and operating systems. It should be easy to adjust for whatever the user needs in their situation. A great site should just work. And to make a site just working, we have to think of the foundation of the internet, which is basically HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And when you do this, what you always have to remember is that a great site doesn't have to be built with a React, Vue, or Angular, or whatever is currently trending on Hacker News and in the front-end ecosystem. What you have to think about is that it always depends on the job. So when someone is asking you, hey, I need a new site, what should I use? You shouldn't answer that you should use Framework X with server-side rendering and offline strategy because everything needs to be a progressive web app and it has to run on the edge. The answer should be, it depends. What's your use case? A great site can be built with React, Vue, and Angular. It doesn't have to be though. A great site is accessible, fast, and secure. And to kind of make this happen, you have to know the foundation of the internet, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And when I talk about HTML, for example, what I see a lot of times is that there are people that are thinking of HTML that it's just HTML. Let me tell you something. HTML defines over 100 different elements. Writing clean HTML, semantically correct, is a craft. Additionally, HTML defines 22 input types. Do you know any of these? These give a better experience on mobile devices or on your browser environment. These are constantly improving. HTML, knowing which HTML elements to use when, is a very, very crucial skill for building great websites. Just recently, Chris Coyer from CSS Tricks published an article which showed the differences of links versus buttons. This is 4,000 words long. For something that might be obvious for a lot of people, but I see a lot of people that don't know the difference here. And this kind of markup I see in a lot of single page applications. It's a meaningless div that uses an area landmark role for time buttons. So the person actually meant well, but this is not clean, great HTML. So overall, when you look around what HTML is out there, you have to admit that HTML is not easy. And to build a great website and making it accessible with a good quality standard, you will find out that we're failing all over the place. Low contrast, missing alt text for images, empty links, missing labels, missing document language, empty buttons, all these kind of things that give a baseline of functionality for our users. We are just messing it up all over the place. And when you look at where the errors and mistakes are, you will find out that a lot of common errors are more likely to be present in JavaScript framework driven sites. And this is nothing against JavaScript frameworks. It totally makes sense, because the more complexity you have to deal with, the less time you have to learn the foundations. If you're dealing with a lot of build pipeline and framework functionality, how can you know all the basics and the foundation? And at the same time, we're shipping sites over sites over sites, and we're not noticing when there's a third party hacked. And we have a lot of thousands of sites that are starting mining cryptocurrency just because we don't care about content, about security. So inside of the web as a foundation as a platform, for example, we have a solid set of headers that can make it possible to secure our website. So what you see there, for example, is the content security policy header that I ship for my own site. This is basically a white list of domains that assets are allowed to be loaded from. With this, whatever happens, there cannot be a third-party script that starts mining cryptocurrency in my site. So this is a very nice thing to have in secure a site. When you look around though, you will find out that only 6% of the internet are using CSP. And I question myself, why is that? Why are we worrying about technology more than caring about making or building a fast, accessible, and secure web? We're also shipping a lot of third parties and JavaScript files that are actually vulnerable, with known vulnerabilities. 80% of the crawled websites, you will see that there are known vulnerabilities inside of their dependencies. Overall, I feel like the web loses quality. But hey, at least developers get more productive, right? Since we have Node and NPM, it's very easy to pull in pre-made functionality to kind of get up to speed quickly and build and ship great stuff. And also the infrastructure gets nicer, right? So I deployed my first Node.js server with Heroku because I'm not a DevOps person. I could just push and that was it. And today we have Netlify site and serverless functions, for example, get more and more traction these days. So what you see there is what it takes to build an HTTP endpoint that returns hello from a string from a Lambda function. If you need a JavaScript or a JSON API, this is all it takes to build your own JSON API. The options to build great products these days are limitless because you can just bring in third parties that all have generous free plans and can connect all the pieces and build very, very great stuff very quickly. But in the same time, the Hello World example, which was when I started an HTML file with a little bit of CSS, JavaScript and HTML, also became way, way heavier. And that might be okay. But what happened at the same time is that the complexity grew and grew and grew and grew. And this is something that I have a problem with. So when we now look at, for example, at Tiny Helpers, which was the side project I mentioned 10 minutes ago, to add a new site or a new helper, what you have to do is you have to clone the repository, you have to run npm install, and then you can run an npm script. And the person reached out to me and was like, hey, I love the site, but that he had to download 700 megabytes of Node.js stuff to add 8 lines of JSON is ridiculous when you think of this. And when you look further into the future, if you're doing JavaScript or front-end development for a little bit, you might have considered that already or seen that already. I bet that the person that is maintaining this site just uses a text editor, and that is it. And this will still work in 5 or 10 years. When I look at my site now and I would just leave it as is, and I would like to come back in 5 years and want to edit it, I need a text editor, I need Node.js, I need npm, and most likely I will need these in the current version. I need framework knowledge. And when I come back in 5 years, it could be that it just is broken and I go into dependency hell, that I have to deal with all that complexity that maybe didn't bring a benefit in the first place. People that are working for the industry could have the opinion now that it has never been that easy to build complex apps. And I agree. But does my blog, with a little bit of words and images, does that have to be a complex app with universal JavaScript and isomorphic rendering and all these kind of things? Complexity is king, but what for and where are we going with this trend? So this was the tech stack when I started, and I was already intimidated by that because it felt so much to learn, and I felt that I didn't know anything. The tech stack today is completely different. You have to know the fundamentals, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, frameworks, the ecosystem, how to host. So what are we doing that for? And where's the benefit for the user here? So when I developed Tiny Helpers, I also went initially with a Preact version, which is lightweight React. I did server-side rendering. I used hooks, of course, a custom rendering. I wrote a tiny router. And then at some point I just dropped it. And I went with static HTML. And Jason Miller, basically, he's the maintainer or the author of Preact. He basically said, Stefan, you're right. In that case, a JavaScript framework doesn't make much sense. And ideally, at some point, we reach the state where the tooling that we have figures out when to use a lot of JavaScript and when it does make sense. So what I used then at some point was 16 line of custom handwritten JavaScript that I inlined in the head. And this gave a lot of nice experience. So thinking about what Jason said, maybe one day we will have good enough abstractions. But today I still think that it is very crucial to know the web fundamentals to create the best user experience out there. And you always have to remember that we are shaping tomorrow's job market based on the technology choices we make today. When you ship more and more single-page applications today, this is what people have to deal with tomorrow. And I would love to believe that my job as a web developer today is to build beautiful websites and experiences. But unfortunately, that's not the case. As a web developer today, I have to decide what tools to use, what frameworks to use, what to prioritize, and what is the best way to maintain a project. It just got overly complicated. And you see the first people that are dealing with this, and are working in the industry, that we are losing kind of track on how the internet works. So Chris Coyer just recently tweeted this out, that people working in the industry didn't actually know how to build a website because it's so abstracted away. And when we look at all these big things, how could a beginner or someone who started in this industry 1-2 years ago know about all these things? It feels like we're going more and more into a big split. There are two kind of web developers. There are the web developers that care about GraphQL, React, style components, Webpack. And then there are maybe UX developers that care about interaction design, maybe a little bit of CSS, maybe accessibility is in there. But let's just ask me the question. What does the user care about? Does the user care about if you run on GraphQL with Apollo? I bet not. Your users don't care about your technical implementation. It is just like it is. So when we build for the web, very often I see that we consider developer experience to be very crucial to do our job. But at the end, it is our job. And our job is not to build a great or to have a great developer experience. Our job is to build a great user experience. This is what we're paid for. So overall, I think, or I have to say that I love shiny tools and I really love writing JavaScript. But I want to question you and I want to ask you if it is maybe time to take a step back. And maybe we should start considering the right tools for the best user experience instead of considering the right tools for our happiness. I love this statement or the sentence from Alex Russell. He works for Google. He says that he's kind of part of the anti-JavaScript JavaScript club. And I consider myself to be in that club too. I love JavaScript, but maybe it's not the best choice for the job most of the time. And maybe we should focus on building sites that just work and worry less about the technology behind these. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. And I went on to 40 minutes. So if you have questions, you can just shoot me in Twitter DM or something. I'm happy to answer question. Thank you. Thank you a lot for having me.
On air. Great. So Stefan, thanks for your talk. I think everyone likes it. Just don't see any questions by now, but let's give people 1 or 2 minutes to start typing if they have them. So you can, I don't know, you can greet everyone again.
Hello, everybody.
Berlin.
Yeah, I hope that was not too much questioning around the current state of the web. For me, it's just important that we ship a good user experience for people, and maybe 1 or 2 people question a little bit what we're doing these days in the industry. If you have any questions or something, you can always shoot me an email, or I'm very active on Twitter. So you usually can get me there. It's just my name. It's @Stefan Judis. I usually respond very quickly. Yeah. And that's basically it.
We have one question. I have a question. Maybe you can briefly tell us how to make decision SPA, a server-side render website.
Okay, so you have a single-page application by itself. It has, first of all, the downside that... Are we good here? First of all, I would always go with server rendered HTML in the first place, because a single page application is a traditional single page application usually has the thing that you ship an empty shell, which is just HTML, which then loads some JavaScript, which then usually fetches some API data. You will find out then that you see a loading spinner initially, and this usually is not the greatest user experience. When you look a little bit what Google is measuring, for example, in Lighthouse, or what everybody's pushing towards the faster internet. When you show a loading spinner initially, you're delaying and making it a little bit slow. And this is actually pretty cool what we can do right now, right? You can take a JavaScript framework and you can run it on the server side and then ship some HTML just to get rid of the spinner initially and to give some user experience in the first place. So my recommendation there would be to always kind of go with server render when you could do that, because the overall experience is just a little better. And yeah, and then you have to decide where you want to go with this. If you really need a full-fledged JavaScript framework to enrich and do good stuff, or if HTML does the job. But overall, a classic single-page application, I would move away from spinners to guarantee a better experience.
So another question. Thank you. While adding more expensive JS on initial load, we reducing subsequent navigation costs. Stefan, do you think it makes sense to use some kind of subsequent navigation performance metric?
I totally think that this makes sense, and I believe that at some point we will eventually get there. Because this is basically what JavaScript frameworks are solving, right? When you, for example, look at, I don't know, I mentioned in the talk Gmail. When you look at Gmail, I'm fine with getting a lot of JavaScript because I have everything there to get a lot of functionality. And I will usually, if I open Gmail, I will usually spend a lot of time in Gmail. Or if I go to Facebook or Twitter, usually I will spend a lot of time there. So I think these applications are a good case for JavaScript frameworks because it kind of makes sense to give me, to preload all the things that I need in further navigations. So, and I think right now as an industry that we're a little bit missing the kind of a metric that figures out when does it make sense to ship that much more JavaScript, right? I also mentioned Jason Miller, and he was like, yeah, basically for this little project that you built, a JavaScript framework doesn't make sense because there's not much functionality and people are not moving around this site that much. I feel like hopefully in the future, we will figure out a metric to do this. But when you think about it, it's actually not that easy to do because it's a mixture of several things. So when you look at your website or at a website, you first of all have to figure out, okay, how much interactivity is in there? I don't know how much you can automate that. Maybe some smart people will figure that out. But then there's also the question, how many times do people actually navigate from A to B, right? I brought the example of people on my personal blog that they usually just visit 1 to 2 pages. And for that, you need some additional data. And this most likely will make it impossible to just bump it into web page tests or bump it into Lighthouse or something. But maybe we will find a way to kind of correlate performance metrics and these kind of decisions with analytics data that we have from someplace. So I would love to see some ideas, and maybe we can just bounce a little around, bounce some ideas a little bit around to kind of figure out what would make sense. But I totally think that right now the industry is kind of lacking a metric like this.
Okay, another question. Would you like to create your own library or framework, which is more developer experience plus user experience oriented, more than other ones in the market?
So I wouldn't create my own library, but most of the time when I build for the web, I found out that we kind of, with our need or with our desire for developer experience, we very often create our own problems. And so what I do these days is, first of all, I evaluate what I want to build. And then I just go with a few custom lines of JavaScript to do the kind of things. I'm talking about a content site here, for example, right? So I wouldn't call the things that I build a framework, but it has a better user experience for sure. If it gets more complex, I usually tend to go with a framework because a framework is usually battle tested. It runs on several sites in production. Running completely your own thing always comes with a problem of maintenance, right? I mean, writing or building your own framework is great for learning purposes, but in the long run, usually it's just more work than benefit, because it's just a lot of work to get out, to get rid of all the bugs that will be in there. Yeah, so would you like to? So creating your own framework and library, I'm always a little bit hesitant because it's a lot of work, and very often you just need some custom tailored JavaScript, which I wouldn't call a framework.
Okay, another one. What do you think for Nuxt.js and Next.js?
So I'm a big fan of both of these, right? I think they're nice tools that offer a great user experience, so developer experience for me. But these two frameworks do the kind of same thing. I know that for Next, there's a pre-act builder with it that ships not that much JavaScript. I think both of these framework, and it's the same for Gatsby maybe. So I usually talk about these three in one thing. It's Nuxt, Next, and Gatsby. I think these three things are beautiful pieces of software. I would be careful when to use these, though. If you're building, like, let's say, I don't know, let's say 50 to 100 landing pages where the only functionality is maybe a button that toggles something to open and close, I would question the fact if you need Vue or React to do that. Because at the end, what all these kind of frameworks do these days is they just add complexity over complexity over complexity. And the problem that a lot of developers then run into is that you have to ship way more JavaScript, you have to parse way more JavaScript, and the whole thing just gets more complex and complex. And these tools are great in what they do. And I use Nuxt and Next in several projects, but I would say, yeah, maybe sometimes a little bit of less complexity do the job just fine. And use the right tools for the job is what I would say about these.
And I think we have the last questions because we are out of time. And guys, if you have any questions, as Stefan said, please write him to Twitter or email, and he'll be happy to answer them. So the last one. I use Next.js for the landing page or a business card site for companies. The admin panel itself is purely React. Is it good, or would you recommend a different approach?
So that is very hard to tell without looking at it, but a kind of landing page or business card site sounds a little bit like there is not much interactivity, and that this basically boils down to static HTML. So this sounds a little bit like a case where Next.js feels a little bit like over-engineered for me. But when you go for example, thinking about an admin panel, one would have to have a look at it. But if you think about an admin panel, this kind of goes for me into the direction, yeah, there's probably a lot of interactivity. There's maybe filtering going on, searching, maybe some interactions. So React there, without having seen it, sounds like a good choice to me. For the typical landing page business card set, I would question that a little bit. There's the case, though, maybe you have some components that you share between the admin app and maybe the stuff that you have in the landing page or business card set. Maybe you want to share some things there, which would make a little bit of a case for running with Next.js there. But I would always kind of question, okay, how much complexity is actually needed? Maybe you can just use Next.js for templating and you can get rid of all the client-side JavaScript after all, because this is always the question, right? Now, when you ship, or if you ship 50, 100, 200, 500K of JavaScript, what does that actually make better inside of the website that you ship that wouldn't be there without all this JavaScript? Because if you ship all these kind of things without enriching or making anything better, I think that then we as developers or as JavaScript engineers should maybe take this step back, as I said. It's like, maybe we can just drop all this if it's the same. So answering this question is a little bit tricky without seeing the example, but yeah. I would go for content sites. Maybe I would take a step back, but it depends on the case. As always, it depends.
It depends. Thank you very much, Stefan, for your talk, for answering questions, and for being with us. We still hope to see you whenever we meet. We are always happy to see you. And have a good day. Bye-bye. Everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. So we're switching to Sarah in a few minutes.
Say hi to Sarah.
Okay.
Also for Berlin.
Yes. Berlin is joining us. Okay. Just 2 minutes and we are on air.